Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio. You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
One of the biggest issues on the agenda this week, and perhaps the biggest issue, is whether Israel should extend sovereignty over the Jordan Valley. Behind all the noisy rhetoric on the issue are several fairly simple sub-issues. According to the Trump plan, the Jordan Valley is one of the areas that will belong to Israel, while there are other areas that will belong to a Palestinian state if it ever gets created. On the other hand, the Palestinians have refused to discuss the Trump plan at all and have refused to negotiate. And while they're refusing to negotiate, they're saying at the same time that if Israel applies sovereignty over any area, even if allotted to Israel under the Trump plan, they will riot and start another intifada. The King of Jordan and a number of Arab countries have expressed their opposition to Israel annexing anything, even if allotted to Israel under the Trump plan. In Israel, both on the left and the right, their positions have been stated. The left is opposed to annexation, has staged protests against it, while the right has pushed for annexation and has held rallies in favor of it. There's also an election approaching in the United States, and the Democrats have already announced that they are against annexation, and at the moment, the Democratic candidate is doing well in the polls. All this is taking place against a background of coronavirus, while the country is operating only at half steam. So there is never a dull moment. And I want, by the way, to add a personal apology. At the end of the third part of my program, I didn't sign off properly because I thought it was only the second part. So that's sort of embarrassing, but I fear that the listeners will catch the error. So I apologize now. I'll be back in a moment. I just wanted to, here in the introduction, to mention the main issues which are facing Israel at the moment, and they're going to become more important over the next several months, particularly because the American election is coming up. So there is never a dull moment, for better or for worse. Thanks for listening. I'll be right back.
Always challenging the status quo. Hello, I'm Rod Bryant on Beyond the Matrix here at IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. I want to encourage you to listen each week, every Wednesday at the same time, for an amazing show that will challenge you, inform you, and inspire. News, views, and wisdom for the nations here on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. Don't forget, Beyond the Matrix every week, Wednesday, here on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com.
You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
You're back with Jay Shapiro. The hottest item on the agenda here in Israel now is not the coronavirus. That's sort of background to other things. The hottest item on the agenda is whether Israel should apply sovereignty over the Jordan Valley sometime between the 30th of July and the American election in November. There's always the possibility that the Democrats will win the election, and they are opposed to Israeli settlement. Whether sovereignty over some or all of the settlements is declared or not, there's something that the government should be doing in the meantime, and that is they should be building and establishing facts on the ground. Our government should be growing the Israeli population in areas that are key to Israel's security and also our historical claims in Judea and Samaria. We should be building now while have time and have a clear understanding with the present administration, and we should particularly buttress our hold on the Jerusalem envelope. What we need is more construction, particularly in the Jerusalem area. Strategically, Jerusalem is a zone of settlement that runs west to east from the Mediterranean Sea, from Tel Aviv to the Jordan Valley, from Jaffa on the sea to Jericho. Israel should be building apartments in this strategic sector over the next 5 years to shore up its religious, historical, and national security stake in the very center of the land of Israel. This includes all of the Jerusalem neighborhoods and the blocks that strategically flank Jerusalem, specifically Gush Etzion in the south, Givat Zev, Bet El and Ophrah in the north, Ma'ale Adumim in the east, and especially in the E1 corridor between Jerusalem and Ma'ale Adumim. Just take a look at a map and you'll understand what I'm speaking about. Israel should best concentrate its efforts where it can make the most significant headway, both in terms of numbers and in terms of solidifying strategic interests with minimal backlash. This can be achieved by launching a long overdue massive wave of construction in the broad Jerusalem envelope and in the Jordan Valley. It's important to note that a broad Israeli national consensus exists regarding the Jordan Valley as Israel's eastern security border. We cannot let that be in the hands of anyone else. Polls showed that a solid majority of Israelis support home building and the application of Israeli law to these areas. Well, at the same time, we can make territorial compromises with the Palestinians elsewhere. Moving ahead with construction that conforms to the American plan makes sense. Our government, and it's a coalition government, can agree to this. This could even contribute to a realignment in Israeli politics toward the center. In each of his recent election campaigns, and we've had 3 in the last year and a half, our Prime Minister promised to ramp up home development, particularly in the Jerusalem envelope. Since then, however, there's little evidence of concrete follow-up, which is strange, given that the Trump administration and the Sunni Arab world have made it clear that they quite understand Israel's needs in this regard. And they're pretty tired of all these extremist Palestinian demands for a Judea and Samaria which have no Jews. The other countries around us, the Arab countries, are much more concerned about Iran than the construction of middle-class homes for Israelis in places like Ma'ale Adumim. In fact, some Gulf states openly have embraced this new dynamic whereby they can move toward partnership with Israel on a wide range of issues, even if disagreements regarding the Palestinian independence remains. There has been a big change in regional and American calculations. Now, this is sort of surprising to some of the Europeans, but that's the way it is. So Israel should not freeze development of its strategic and historic heartland while waiting endlessly for a peaceful and democratic Palestinian political culture to miraculously emerge while waiting for a compromise deal with the Palestinian leadership. Then the Palestinian leadership doesn't even want to sit down and talk to Israel. In the past, over and over again, Israel has been told or warned this is not the right time to build. The times are too sensitive. You hear this from the Europeans in particular, and you hear it from the Israeli left. They tell us not to rock the boat, that maybe there'll be possible negotiations with the Palestinians. However, this no longer holds. There's no near negotiation because of Palestinian rejectionism. The settlement and security zones that always remain Israel are clear. They're made clear by the American peace plan. They include, for example, the Jordan Valley. Israel even has the cover of some Arab states for asserting its essential rights. It has a national unity government. This is obviously the right time to build. Most of the most vociferous opponents of applying sovereignty over parts of the what's called the West Bank are former senior security officials here in Israel, former army officers who use their professional authority to convince the public that a wide range of grave risks would attend such a move. According to these individuals, the application of sovereignty would expose Israel to multiple deeply threatening dangers, as in any case unnecessary. The implication of this line of thinking is that Israel's current strategic position has no risk associated with it, and hence it is preferable to remain the way we are than go to a new position that would result from the application of sovereignty, particularly in the Jordan Valley. This, I believe, is a misrepresentation of reality. If the Israeli government misses the opportunity presented by President Trump's plan to apply sovereignty, the risks to Israel multiply, they do not decrease. This is because Israel will not be able to preserve its temporary security presence in the Jordan Valley forever. And the Jordan Valley, our eastern border, is vital to our security. The choice facing our government today is between the more or less recognized risks associated with applying sovereignty and the less knowable but undoubtedly serious risks inherent in the collapse of the status quo. The dangers to Israel of a full withdrawal appear to be obscure to the so-called experts. There was a thing called the Allen Plan under the Obama era. It was advocated a complete withdrawal of Israeli forces from the Jordan Valley. This is also apparently the basic plan for a permanent status agreement as outlined by a group now of former army commanders who have gotten together, and they have a website called Commanders for Israel Security. A full withdrawal would bring the kind of threat currently posed by Hezbollah and Hamas all the way from the Jordan Valley to the outskirts of Highway 6 on the outskirts of Tel Aviv. The Israeli public must weigh the risks inherent in the application of sovereignty against the severity of the risk of total withdrawal. This is not an easy task, as the latter set of risks is being minimized for public consumption by the so-called experts and members of the military elite. It is very important to make it understandable. The Prime Minister's plan to apply sovereignty would have no effect on the vast majority of Palestinians living in so-called areas A and B, which have been under Palestinian Authority control since January 1996. Even if the authority decides to cease to exist, it's not a foregone conclusion that there will be a need to return to the military administration. The Israeli government has been given an opportunity, one that may well never return, to promote the country's vital national interest and bolster its future. This is an opportunity not only to expand territorial control, but also to reposition Israel as a nation that will dare to act on its own behalf, even in the face of threats. This is the embodiment of sovereignty. That's what sovereignty means: political power and political independence. And only by applying Israeli sovereignty to at least The Jordan Valley, our eastern border, will Israel be able to exhibit and manifest political power and political independence. If we are an independent state, we have to act in this manner. I'll be back after the break.
Shalom, everybody. Making a difference often takes just one moment and one person at a time. I am Orly Benny Davis, your show host on Israel News Talk Radios from Jerusalem with love. You'll be hearing people talking about politics, religion, social issues, and making a better tomorrow. Join me, Orly Benny Davis, for God and Country. From Jerusalem with love.
Wednesdays on Israel News Talk Radio.
You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
You're back with Jay Shapiro. I'm not quite sure whether what I'm going to speak about in this segment of the program goes under the general title of Under the Radar, things you don't notice. I'm not sure, but I'm going to go ahead anyhow because I can't resist. Right now, the United States is going through an orgy of pulling down statues. Even the statues of Columbus and Lincoln and Theodore Roosevelt and Confederate generals and so forth. They have to keep in mind, by the way, that of the 56 signers of the American Declaration of Independence, 41 were slave owners. So those are in the process now of pulling down statues. There's no limit. I don't think there's going to be many statues left. But I particularly want to relate to one statue, which is in the city of St. Louis. First, a very quick background. I recall one time I was traveling around the States in the winter time, about 40 years ago. I had been in a lot of cities, like 2 or 3 cities each day, close together, particularly on the East Coast. I was speaking with Jewish federations, and I left the airport in St. Louis in a snowstorm, and I was driving toward the city. And as I passed through University City, I looked through the front of my windshield, which was pretty much covered with snow, and I saw a sign that said something like the Yeshiva of St. Louis or the Jewish Day School of St. Louis, like that. And I was a little bit disoriented at the moment. And I thought to myself, why did the Jewish community decide to name a Jewish day school after a Catholic saint? But then I recovered and I remembered where I was. Now that brings us to the subject at hand, which has to do with very interesting Jewish and Muslim cooperation. While they're taking down statues all over the country, according to the newspaper this week, Jews and Muslims in St. Louis have launched a petition to take down a monument to their city's namesake and even hope to rename the city of St. Louis. St. Louis is named after King Louis IX, the only French king to be canonized by the Catholic Church, who's considered by the Church to be a model Christian monarch. King Louis IX was also a notorious anti-Semite. He oversaw one of the infamous medieval disputations in which rabbis were forced to debate with Christians, and the subsequent burning of 12,000 copies of the Talmud in 1243. He required Jews to wear badges so they could be easily identified. He outlawed banking, which led to the expulsion of many Jews from France and the confiscation of their property. The funds that Louis IX confiscated went toward his two crusades in 1248 and 1270 to fight Islamic kingdoms for control over the land of Israel. Louis IX is honored with the entire city of St. Louis being named after him and a big statue in a park in St. Louis. Now, the interesting news item is that Umar Lee and Moji Siddiqui, Muslims, they're an organization called Muslims for a Greater St. Louis, together with an Israeli-American restaurateur named Ben Poremba, want to change that and have launched a petition. According to them, and I quote, "For those unfamiliar with King Louis IX, the petition says he was a rabid anti-Semite who spearheaded many persecutions against the Jewish people, was also vehemently Islamophobic, and led a murderous crusade against Muslims, which ultimately cost him his life." This is the petition. The petition calls the city's name an outright disrespect to the Jewish and Muslim communities. And so they want to have the name of the city changed, and they want to have his statue pulled down. And Umar Lee, the Muslim who's heading up this effort, said, and I quote, "If you look at modern St. Louis and modern America, of course, anti-Semitism still exists and anti-Muslim bias still exists. But that's not the person you want to have overlooking your city in the statue. He's on a horse with a sword, and that sword was aimed at people living very far away from France. I don't think it's a good symbol for our city," unquote. Now, these people who made the petition admitted that renaming the city is less likely in getting the statue taken down, but they're doing what they can. By the way, they're suggesting the name of the city should be changed to Confluence, because the city is where the Mississippi and Missouri rivers come together. Another person suggested the name Scott because it was where Dred Scott first sued for his freedom from slavery, which led to the notorious 1857 U.S. Supreme Court ruling that the U.S. Constitution does not apply to black people. That's a story unto itself. If you study history, you know that. Now, needless to say, I don't know what's going to be, but one thing for sure so far, and it's certainly going to grow, and that is that Catholics in St. Louis have come out against these efforts, calling it an affront to their religious beliefs. And by the way, in 2017, about 23% of the city's residents were Catholics. So it's very interesting now that I think the effort to bring down the statue of St. Louis or to change the name of the city is going to bring about a lot more enmity among the various religious groups in the city. And I have to assume that the Jewish day school will continue with the name St. Louis. So I just want to share this with the listeners because it struck me as so odd, a thing like this. I remember, by the way, as I said, I was in St. Louis. It's a big statue, very big statue. Anyhow, this orgy of pulling down statues does not bode well for the United States, and I don't want to discuss it in detail, but I think it's important just to bring it up. I watch television, I listen to the radio, I see what's happening in the United States, and I worry for the United States because of this disorder that's taking place right now. I'm going to switch gears now to a completely different subject, but I think it's important. It's really under the radar. There is a large Druze community in Israel, Druze. The Druze are a community, they have a secret religion, and they serve in the army here. I myself have served in the army together with Druze. They're drafted in large numbers into the Israeli army, and many serve in elite units. And there are several high-ranking Druze officers. And the first Druze became a pilot, got his wings back in June last year. Now, what's going to happen now is something really interesting. A leader of the Druze community has come up with a Druze High-Tech Empowerment Center. It's going to open in July 25th in Yusfia, which is a Druze majority town. And there are 140,000 members of Israel's Druze community. And a gentleman by the name of Halabi founded a Druze Veterans Association back in 2009. And since then, he secured scholarships and found jobs for hundreds of Druze youth who, after their discharge from the army, were looking for employment. Now, many Druze have succeeded in the legal, medical, and military fields. And like I said, I've served with Druze, and I've met Druze lawyers, and I've met Druze doctors, but they feel that more Druze should be in the high-tech sector, since all Israelis deserve to enjoy the benefits of Israel being a startup nation. So the goal of this association is to increase access and fully integrate Druze veterans into all aspects of Israeli society. And I think it's a very worthy thing. And they're going to try to raise the motivation of Druze veterans to enter the technological innovation field. And they want to drop the number who start going to the university and then they drop out in the middle. By the way, it's very funny. I remember when I served together with Druze, I was one station with a Druze unit. I was the only Jew in the Druze unit, and when I was speaking with them, they told me what their life is like, and they told me something that really struck me as interesting, and that is they go to college, and the most difficult thing they find about going to college, particularly Haifa University, because the Jews live up in the north near Haifa, the thing they find most difficult is sitting in the same classroom with girls, with women, because in the Jewish society, the men and women are separated very much like the Orthodox Jews, or what they call the Haredi Jews, and just sitting in a class with a girl is difficult for them. Anyhow, hopefully they'll get more involved in technology in Israel. I'll be back after the break.
You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
This is Shai Bentako, and each week I'll be webcasting to you from Judea, origin of the word Jew, a people besieged and beleaguered in every generation. Nazi Germany's but a memory, but in its place the world invented the phantom Palestinians as this generation's internationally authorized Jew killers. Tune in for a different slant on life in Israel, Phantom Nation, every Monday.
Hi, I'm Rabbi David Aaron. The soul basics are the most profound, the most essential, and yet often the most neglected in our education. Join me for Soul Talk on Israel's News Talk Radio and discover the secrets to love, spiritual growth, and personal power.
You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
You're back with Jay Shapiro. Over the next couple of weeks, or even months, there'll be a lot of opportunity to talk about whether Israel should apply sovereignty, particularly to the Jordan Valley. In the meantime, I just want to touch upon some quotations, more or less, from a former an Israeli diplomat named Yoram Ettinger. He's a friend of mine, and he really understands the American government, and he stays in contact even today with a lot of American legislators. So he asked the question whether the Trump plan will be promoted or suspended appears to largely depend on the U.S. election campaign timetable. Trump is convinced that the presentation of the plan is helpful to Israel and it will convince supporters of Israel to vote for him. And consequently, Trump is carefully leveraging the plan to dovetail with his campaign. And Israel, too, the feeling is that this is a once in a lifetime opportunity. As a matter of fact, once in a lifetime is not even the right expression. It's the first time in 2,000 years this opportunity has come along. And so, in view of this not a too unrealistic prospect that Trump may turn out to be a one-term president, how are we supposed to act? But the question we have to ask ourselves, are the promises and commitments of an American president binding on his successor? So, according to Ettinger, who, by the way, as I said, maintains ongoing ties with people in America, he replies with a disturbing note to that question whether it's binding on a successor. And he's backed by past experience, including but not limited to Israel's own experience. According to Ettinger, even if the American assurances come from the purest of intentions, it's important to understand that since the establishment of the United States back in the 18th century and up to the present, certain features have always been part of these commitments. One is that assurances are never specific. The current plan calls for Israel's security control from the Jordan to the Mediterranean. But the question we have to ask ourselves is what defines control? What is Israeli control? And what does Palestinian control mean? Today, Trump is defining it, but tomorrow it may be Joe Biden who defines it. And what's certain is that each will interpret according to how he sees the situation, and certainly Biden and Trump will have contrary views. And by the way, no commitment is automatic. The fact that there's a promise to carry out the commitment doesn't mean it will happen immediately. So that brings us to another point, and that is that every assurance is subject to American interest at the time designated for its implementation. And the interests are determined by the president sitting in the White House at that time. All this means that an American assurance is open to interpretation. Now, this position is based on past experience. Anyone who thinks that an assurance is etched in stone should examine a very important binding agreement, the NATO Treaty, which states that an armed attack against any member shall be deemed an attack against them all, and that members shall consider such action as it deems necessary, including use of armed force. That's what is the definition of the NATO treaty. Now, in other words, it's something to be considered at the time. There's always the option of deciding that it's not the right time for military intervention or that events don't justify it. In other words, commitments can be made in good faith, but when the actual moment comes, there could be rational considerations, that cause the United States to back off from a commitment. There's nothing illegal about it. The assumption needs to be the assurance, even if it comes from a place of goodwill toward Israel, is simply not etched in stone. And this is because of the American system. It's important to understand how the American system works. In the United States, the president may make commitments, but there's a powerful legislature, the Congress, And if the president wants his commitments to be ratified, binding, he must receive the ratification of 2/3 of the Senate. In other words, 67 out of 100 senators. And he gives an example. This occurred in 1999 and 2000 when President Clinton signed a series of agreements with the international community, the so-called Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, prohibiting nuclear testing, and the Rome Statute, which established the International Criminal Court in The Hague. Today, he signed, but he didn't submit the Rome Statute for Senate ratification. While the Test Ban Treaty was not ratified but defeated in the Senate. Consequently, whether or not the U.S. upholds the agreements or not, the fact is if it wants to, the U.S. can withdraw from any article of the agreements because they were never ratified by the legislature. And there's all kinds of historic examples of this. This is not something novel. And he goes on to give an interesting example about Israel. In 1957, Ben-Gurion, our prime minister, agreed to withdraw from the entire Sinai Peninsula after the Sinai campaign because he received a written guarantee from President Eisenhower that if Egypt violated the agreements or the militarization, or they blocked passage to a lot, the U.S. would view this as a casus belli and act accordingly. In 1967, Egypt indeed violated the agreement, and there was a question in Israel whether they should launch a preemptive war. It turned out to be the 1967 war. Many in the government in Israel opposed a preemptive strike, and our prime minister at that time was Eshkol. He personally appealed to President Johnson and sent Israel's foreign minister Abba Eban to Washington, and they showed President Johnson President Eisenhower's written guarantee. But Johnson proceeded to lecture the Israeli leaders on the need to understand the U.S. system they were working with. As a matter of fact, Johnson was quoted as saying, "I may be a tall Texan, but I'm a short president." He's facing a Congress that doesn't want to send U.S. troops overseas. And he further explained that Eisenhower's letter was a presidential order that barely bound Eisenhower himself. Eisenhower's commitment wasn't worth even a solitary dime, according to Johnson. And if Eshkol acted alone, he would find himself alone in the international arena as well. And there are other examples. By the way, the U.S. doesn't even have to wait for a new president to be elected in order to ignore the decisions of a previous one. There are examples of agreements being abrogated by the very same president that signed them. For example, in January 1991, the Americans made a supreme effort to keep Israel from responding to the Scud missiles Iraq fired on Israel. In order to convince our Prime Minister Shapiro to remain passive, they explained that they understood Israel's predicament, but the Gulf War was an American theater and consequently requested Israel to hold back, and that if it did so, the U.S. would devote 30% of its aerial bombings to the destruction of Scud launching sites. And they repeated they would consider giving Israel $10 billion in loan guarantees to help Israel absorb the Jews immigrating to Israel from the Soviet Union. What actually happened was they dedicated only 3% of their bombings, not 30%. They didn't conduct low-altitude flights, but rather flew at high altitude and withheld the loan guarantees, but they gave them later to a later Israeli administration. The bottom line is that these remarks are not aimed at criticizing American actions, but Israel has to realize with whom it's dealing. You can't fool the Israeli public into thinking you have guarantees that don't exist. The Israeli prime ministers have a habit of doing that. And the writing is in the wall. The best case scenario will turn out to be true, but the opposite option also exists, and good statesmanship must take not only the best case scenario into account, but also the worst case scenario. By the way, in the Middle East, best case scenarios rarely happen. So that's a general comment about the issue of Israel applying sovereignty. Obviously, I'll speak more about this in the future because we're approaching the July 30th date, and a lot of things will be happening both in Israel and the reaction to what Israel does by the Europeans and by the Americans and by the other Arab countries, particularly the Sunni countries who are afraid of Iran. So this is a very interesting time, as again, there's an ancient Chinese curse. I hope you live in interesting times. I'll be back after the break.
Israel News Talk Radio's chat room. Just click the orange button at the top of the IsraelNewsTalkRadio.home page, log in as yourself or an anonymous guest, and join in on the fun. You'll meet other listeners from all over the world who listen to Israel News Talk Radio, and you can make new friends. Israel News Talk Radio's chat room. It's the closest you can get to being in the studio with us.
We love listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Where can you get the inside news on Israel? At Israel News Talk Radio, we're dedicated to sharing Israel's inside story with the world by providing our listeners with news on Israeli politics, current affairs, and Israeli Jewish culture. The Israel News Talk Radio homepage also provides you, the listener, with useful information at your fingertips, with scrolling news headlines, weather, currency exchange, Shabbat candlelighting times, and so much more. Our radio programming is always accessible and on demand. We operate absolutely free of charge for everyone, everywhere. If you love what we do, partner with us now by becoming an Israel News Talk Radio supporter. With your support, you'll be inscribed on our Israel News Talk Radio Wall of Fame. There's nothing like us in the world. Be part of something great. Israel News Talk Radio. Straight talk from Israel.
If you love Israel News Talk Radio, then you'll love our Facebook page. We keep you up to date on what's happening in Israel, plus little surprise treasures that we don't share on the radio. Go now to follow us on Facebook. Just look for the Israel News Talk Radio Facebook page, and don't forget to subscribe and follow us by clicking on the like button. We post great stuff there that you'll want to share. Israel News Talk Radio on Facebook and Israel News Radio on Twitter.
News, opinion, and more. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.